Here's a knife from Uddo, and it has multiple features, aspects, that if you're at all familiar with his work, relatively easy to recognize because they're kind of unique. Now, I have a lot of respect for people who do things in unique ways or innovate in some manner. And most people don't seem to appreciate the difference in complexity and just raw difficulty in trying to do something in a new and innovative way versus just copying or learning a way to do something that's already done. Not that I'm saying there's no skill in learning how to do something well. There is. But trying to come up with a new or better way to do something, or even just different way to do something, is on a completely another level. And sometimes along that way, that process, you have to do 100 things that don't go anywhere to find the one thing that, hey, this actually could be a bit better than the way everyone normally does it. So I have a lot of respect for people who are on that path, regardless of where it ends up to. But Uddo has done a couple of things which are relatively interesting. Now, is he the first person to ever do them? People have been making knives for a long time. And over the years I've seen many times where someone will make that claim, then all of a sudden someone will point out that someone had already done that many years ago. So all I can say is that for some of the issues that I'm going to be discussing, Uddo has certainly incorporated them into his work very strongly. He's popularized them, and whether or not he innovated or completely came up with them on his own is something that's very difficult to prove in any case. So basically, this is a standard neck knife, Kydex sheath, thumb ramp. First thing is that his handle is relatively interesting. A lot of people do cord wrap in epoxy, and they basically wrap the handle in some kind of weave or knot pattern and then soak it in epoxy to protect the cord wrap. What Uddo does is completely layer it, so all texture or pattern of the underlying cord is gone, and all you have essentially is the cord being filler to a solid epoxy handle. It has a very highly reflective sheen. It looks like it would be slick. I thought that it would be slick the first time that I had seen it, but it has a very high traction grip. It's very durable. There's videos where Uddo is soaking this, boiling this, hitting it with a hammer. The only thing that I would say in regards to being negative is that this very nice aesthetic polish is very easy to damage or scratch because, again, this is epoxy. So if you're using the knife in dirty conditions, if your hand gets dirty and you pick it up, it's very easy to mar this finish. But as a working finish, it's epoxy. You can work it with very basic materials. Now, in regards to the handle, there's a couple of interesting things in regards to security. Number one, it has a very deep index finger notch and a dropped blade. These things combine for a relatively strong pseudo guard type effect. Now, Fred Perrin definitely popularized that concept. The interesting thing about doing it this way rather than your traditional extended guard is that you get all the security, or a strong amount of the security, but you don't have that guard getting in the way, which can be an issue with some types of cutting. And you also have the advantages of a dropped blade, which allow you to work close to materials and gives you some amount of knuckle clearance. Not full, because your clearance is mainly up around this area. But still, it's an interesting way to get security in a knife and try to retain maximal function, because again, you don't have that guard sticking out, which can get in the way and prevent some cutting. The other thing that he has done is integrate a rather novel handle extender. So this is essentially a three-fingered grip. Three-fingered grips in general will severely compromise your grip strength much more than you think they would, because a lot of your grip strength comes off your pinky, because that's what you're used to doing it with. Modulator from R.J. Martin. So when you're normally cutting, you push with this part of your hand. You push with your thumb and index finger, and you pull back with your pinky. So you're pushing ahead and you're pulling back with your pinky, and that combination is what gives you the power. If you take your pinky off, yes, you can pull back with your third finger, you can pull back with your index finger, you can even use a one-finger grip and sort of push with your thumb and pull back with your index finger. But you'll find they're all relatively awkward, because you've just been doing this your whole life with your pinky finger, and it'll take some time getting used to it. Now, the advantages of a shorter grip is that because it's so short, you can actually fit it right inside your hand. So you can put the knife in positions that you can't do if the grip was longer. If this grip was longer, of course, I couldn't put the swell in my hand like this, because that would actually force the blade way out here somewhere. And now I can end up having a torque disadvantage because I'm trying to cut here and I got to fight that leverage. Whereas when the handle is short, I can cut right here, so I don't have that torque disadvantage, and I keep the whole handle in my hand, which is interesting for some cutting applications. What the pinky finger extender does basically is it allows you to get your pinky on the handle to some extent. Now, you mightn't think that would make very much of a difference because it's only a loose piece of cord, but again, you've been cutting with your pinky finger your entire life. And like most things that you do, you're not going to be thinking about how you do them. When you pick up a pencil and start writing with it, you don't think about the placement of your fingers. But wait until you get a small cut on one of your fingers and you have to move your finger from that natural position to get the cut off the pencil, and all of a sudden it becomes very awkward and difficult to write. Because again, you're used to doing it a certain way for so long. So this is a very interesting idea that Uddo has, and I really look forward to exploring how this brings utility into the grip. Now, something else, and Fred Perrin sort of talks about this a lot, the ability to work with the knife, retain some kind of grip on it, and still do other things. And that's one of the reasons why he has some features in these grips, because it gives him the ability to work with his hands and still have the knife in it. That's not as much of a big thing to me. I can realize and understand the utility of that, sure, fine. But generally, if I'm doing some kind of detailed work, I'll actually want to put the knife down, because the level of sharpness and cutting ability that I like to keep edges at, I don't want very much of a chance of contact with my hand. But this is an interesting idea for that, if that's the way that you work, because it very easily allows you to have the knife in your hand doing working. You can let it go and you can still keep working with your hands. So it's an interesting idea as well. And this is a classic common style blade pattern that you would see here, reminiscent of a BeaverTail, which is what it's often called. And this has a high flat grind on it, which tapers to a relatively thin edge. Now, I want to talk about a few things about this knife, which are maybe not as positive as some of the things I've been saying so far. The first is that when this sharpening notch or choil was cut out, the steel was burnt to a dark brown and then to a black. That's a bit of a concern. When I slowly rotate the blade in the light, I can see faint straw colors along the primary grind, signs that it may have been overheated as well. A lot of people have the completely wrong idea about heat buildup on a grinder. And you often see arguments as, well, I couldn't possibly have overheated the blade because I could keep my fingers on it. And the blade obviously is much more durable than my fingers. A lot of people make that argument. And it kind of seems like common sense. A lot of things seem like common sense until you realize what common sense is. Common sense is basically the way you've learned to make decisions from what you've observed. So when people say things are common sense, it means it fits in with the way that they have observed things. Think about that for a second. Unless you've observed something, it's not going to be common sense the way that things work. And a lot of ways that you observe things with your eyeballs don't give a very good description of what happens on a very small scale or rather large scale, and you can get some odd effects. So one of the things that mightn't be obvious from a common sense perspective, unless you've observed it in very minute detail, is that when you're pressing with a knife against the grinder and the belt is over here on this side, your fingers are on this side of the blade gets very hot compared to this side. But steel and most metals tend to be relatively good conductors of heat and electricity. So as this part of the blade gets very hot, while the heat is trying to come through to this side, it's also sinking down this way into the main body of the blade, which lowers the temperature. And the air that's moving around it also lowers the temperature. But you can still get this side of the blade very hot, even though you can keep your fingers on this side of the blade. The other argument that people will make is, well, I didn't see any change in color when I was grinding the steel. And in order to see damage in a steel, you got to change the tempering colors. No, you don't. See, those colors, or scale, is a chemical reaction, very similar to how knives rust. And just like stainless steels resist rusting, they also resist the chemical reaction that forms that kind of scale, which means stainless steels and alloy steels in general take much higher exposure to temperatures and much higher exposure to times before they form that kind of scale. The use of coolant or non-use of coolant is one of the more controversial things in the knife industry, which is kind of foolish because if you look at the tooling industry, it's so completely well known to use coolant for all kinds of reasons when you're grinding, not just because of fear of overheating the steel, just from a general productivity viewpoint. But many things in the knife industry are horribly complicated and of a controversy when they're completely well known and accepted outside of it. It's kind of an interesting thing. So anyway, I do have some concerns about the possible heat damage to the blade. The other thing I will mention is that Uddo had made some comments about the lower cutting ability of this blade and blades of this style compared to the single bevel type grinds that he normally does and prefers. And I mentioned, well, a flat grind doesn't simply cut the way that it does because it's flat. It's how you flat grind it. There are many knives with a flat grind that don't cut very well at all because the edge is left too thick or the edge is at a very high angle. It's not going to cut anything even though it's a flat grind. So you could get a saber or partial height grind which cut much better than a flat grind if the edge and the angle were significantly better optimized. When you're working with a knife in terms of optimization, you always go from the edge backwards because that's the most important thing, because the edge is what starts your cutting, it's what initiates the work, and everything else behind it is there to support that. So you get the edge angle right, then you get the edge thickness right, Then you get the area just behind the edge right, which might require use of a transition bevel. Then you look at the primary grind and you get that right, and you might have to do things like fullers and distal tapers and that kind of stuff. But again, it's from the edge back. That's how a knife performs. So the edge on this is around 10 thousandths thick, which is relatively decent. So that's sort of a high performance cutting geometry. There are people that grind thinner. Here's an ultralight folding knife from Collie Harris. Collie often has the edges on his knives under 10 thou thick. Some of them are that small. They're almost close to being micro bevels. This is a friction folder, it doesn't have a lock. But again, 10 thousandths thick, relatively high performance cutting edge. The angle though is over 20 degrees per side. So single bevel knives like Mora's are generally 9 to 11 degrees per side, and that very low angle makes a very efficient wedge. If you've ever used a wedge, or if you've ever used a ramp, you know one of the things that makes them more efficient is the angle. So a ramp which has a very, very low angle is very easy to push something up. Just like a wedge which has a very low angle, it's very easy to jam into something. A wedge with a very high angle is very difficult to jam into something. Essentially, it's a function of how far does the wedge have to go in to push something apart. If the wedge is extremely steep, it has to push something apart a lot for the wedge to go in a little. And the work is done in the pushing the thing apart. So, extremely high angled wedge, now you have to do a lot of work to get it in a little tiny bit. A very low angle wedge goes in with very little work because it doesn't need to push stuff very far apart. So the angle on this is over 20 degrees per side on the edge. So obviously comparing it to a Mora or single bevel grind, which only has a 9 to 11 degree angle on the edge for shallow type cutting, you'll notice a very obvious difference in that this one has much more force because of the lower edge angle. But of course, that has nothing to do with the flat grind. It simply has to do with the fact that the edge is a different angle. There's no reason why you can't sharpen this at 10 degrees per side if you wanted to. And in fact, I'll be adjusting the edge down from the angle that it is now relatively shortly. And this is very critical in a number of reasons. Just like I said, when you're talking about cutting ability and performance, you want to go from the edge back in terms of optimization. From durability perspective, it's even more critical. The most critical thing you can do when you're looking at a durability perspective is to take that, go backwards, get the edge angle, the correct angle for durability, get the edge thickness for durability, and then step back. If you do it the other way, the results can be disastrous. If you have a primary grind that's right for durability, so this knife up here is very strong and it's never going to take any damage. You have the edge angle that's decent for durability. It's not going to take any damage. But you have the edge thickness wrong. Say you undercut the edge thickness and you make it too low. Well, the edge angle is not going to change. It's not going to take any damage. When you're doing cutting, the edge angle, the apex durability, which is controlled by the edge angle, the apex never gets damaged. You do even really hard work, no sign of damage to the edge. You start pushing, you do a little bit more force, and where's it going to fail? At the edge thickness. So the blade is going to ripple and wobble, and that's very difficult for you to fix. So you want to set your failures the other way. You want to start at the apex. You always want the apex to be your weakest point, because when you're cutting, your sign that you're using the knife a bit too hard should be that you see damage right at the apex, right at the very point. And then you say, okay, I better back off now, I'm getting a bit too sloppy, I'm getting a bit too much, using a bit too much force. A lot of people put way too much of an angle on their edge, so the apex is very durable and the apex never gets damaged. But then when they do push the knife too hard, bam, it blows out somewhere else. It's very bad if you undercut the edge thickness. It's horrible if you undercut the primary grind, because then you could blow a big scallop right out of the knife, and the knife would be perfectly fine right up until that. No damage to the edge, no damage to the apex, and then boom, a piece blows out of the primary grind. So again, when you're optimizing a knife from cutting ability, you work from the edge to the spine. When you're optimizing a knife from durability, that's the same way that you think about it. Make sure that the edge is always your most critical perspective, because that's the thing doing the cutting. That's the first line of action. So make sure your edge angle is the absolute minimal that it needs to be. That'll give you your maximum cutting ability, and it also serves as an early warning sign, because it will start taking a little bit of damage when you start doing heavier abusive work, and then you can realize, okay, I need to back off a little bit here, or I'm going to start damaging something. Now, the last thing I want to make a mention on is sharpness. So sharpness is one of the things in the cutting industry and in knives, cutlery industry, that's not well understood. It's not a complicated concept at all. The sharpness of a knife essentially is, looking at the apex, when you start a cut, when you just start pressing the knife into the material, there's a very specific thing that happens to the material. The material breaks apart. If you look at it on a very small scale, you can clearly see that. So when you push the knife into a material, the material breaks apart. Just like when you take a balloon, you pop it with a pin. The balloon, boom, pops. In order for material to break apart, there has to be a certain pressure put on it. That's called a rupture pressure. Little tiny bit of basic physics. Pressure increases as area decreases. And everyone knows this because they sort of experienced it in life. If you ever had someone walk on your foot while they were wearing very small spiked heel shoes, you realize very quickly that that hurts a lot more than someone who doesn't have high spiked heels, because the area is very small. You walk on a nail, bam, it goes up into your foot. Why? The area is very small, so the pressure is very high, even though the force mightn't be very high. Well, as an edge gets sharper, it comes to a cleaner apex. That very, very small point of the edge, which you can't see by eye because it's a fraction of a micron, gets thinner and thinner and thinner. So the edge width, that little strip that you can't see because it's so small, that gets more and more narrow, which means it makes very high pressures when you touch the knife against something. So it's very easy for it to cut because it exceeds that rupture pressure, and that's how cutting actually starts. So from a fundamental point of view, mechanics, it's very easy to understand sharpness. Unfortunately, in the knife industry, it isn't thought about that way. Sharpness is thought about in a number of other ways. Some of them are kind of odd. One of the most popular ones is that knives are sharper when they're polished more, which is not necessarily the case. This knife has one of the classic behaviors that's very common from knives that are used on sharpening wheels, buffers, and it's being extensively stropped. And it's that the edge is completely smooth. It's rounded over. Now, a lot of people think that's the way polished edges behave because the only polished edges they've seen are like that. And that's sort of where common sense throws you for a loop. Again, it's common sense to you because your experience is you've only seen that. So all the polished edges you've seen come off strops. You know, someone's sitting there doing 50 to 100 passes. They completely round over the edge. So the edge of a knife, the apex, should look like that. Very, very thin. It comes to a point. When people start stropping and using buffers, it's very easy to round over the apex, so it ends up with a round or an arc on it that's completely smooth. That lowers the sharpness on a slice tremendously, and in this case it's completely eliminated. It has almost no slicing aggression. Now, I know this has no slicing aggression because I started off measuring the sharpness by cutting light threads, light cords, and I'm just talking about sewing threads, not like 3/8" manila rope. So I cut a number of very light sewing threads, measured the push cutting sharpness, measured the slicing sharpness, and the slicing sharpness was non-existent. Like less than 5%, meaning it's very difficult to actually measure it. Push cutting sharpness was decent. So once I knew the slicing sharpness wasn't there, then I can do things like this because I know it's not there. That's not a sensible way to see if your knife has sharpness. Hey, I wonder if this knife is sharp. Well, if it is, you just cut your finger off. That's a common misunderstanding of what Murray Carter is doing when he's doing his test of 3-finger sharpness. And people seem to think that what you're trying to do is to see if you can cut your fingers off. That's not it. Anyway, Murray has a decent understanding and explanation of what he's actually trying to achieve. But to just show you how dramatic this effect can be, I can press this knife into my skin hard enough to actually dent it significantly and draw it, and nothing happens. Because again, the edge has been completely rounded, buffed over. Polished edges don't have to behave like that. And in fact, if you pick up commercial scalpel or razor blades, they have very high polished edges, but you can't do that with your skin. You'll completely slice it open. And that's one of the reasons why I don't advocate buffers, paper wheels, or strops for sharpening. Not that you can't get a properly sharpened edge off them, you can, but they're very prone to creating that type of problem. They're that prone to it that there's a huge segment of the knife industry that believes that's how polished edges actually behave. And that's one of the things that you have to try to trade off between having a polished edge and a coarse edge, because you can't get polished edges that slice well. That's not the case. There is some trade-off, but it's not necessarily that dramatic. So that's some comments on the new knife I have from Uddo. I look forward to using it. It's going to be a rather interesting tool to work with, and I'm especially interested in working with the grip extender and seeing how it allows me to get the grip utility and versatility of a much smaller handle and still retain the high force leverage cutting and positionability and control of a larger handle by retaining the use of the pinking. Very interesting concept to work with.